Constant bombing on all Syrian cities and 61 victims died today, mostly in Hama, Idlib and Deir ez-Zor. Activists speak about the destruction of entire neighborhoods in Homs, while the Syrian Freedom Army warns of a genocide.
لأقوى وأعنف قصف تمهيدي بالصواريخ والمدفعية والدبابات ويحضر هذا النظام.
And a huge crowd condemned the crimes in Aleppo. Citizens in Damascus cut off the Corniche Road in Al Maidan neighborhood. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The Human Rights Network said that 61 people have died today, most of them in Hama, where the bombing continued, and the regime forces buried around 15 bodies that reportedly belonged to prisoners in a graveyard east of Hama. The regime's militia conducted raids and arrests in the neighborhoods of Tariq Halab, Mashal Arba'in, and leaked videos show the bombings taking place in the suburbs of Hama. Also, protests continued in many cities such as Sheikh, Kaversita, Tariq Halab, Al-Bab Qabli, and Al-Madiq Castle, all demanding the punishment of the regime. Many towns and villages in Hama are being shelled by the regime forces. This comes along with arrests and robbing campaigns where al-Assad forces robbed many houses and shops. More about Hama we see in the following report.
The regime's bombardment continued constantly on many towns and villages in Hama, where it reached every corner and area indiscriminately. The bombardment even targeted people, where the regime forces opened fire on ordinary civilians no matter where they were walking. The orders were given to the soldier Omran to shoot at buildings, as he applies the orders that were given to him by higher officers. The invasion and arrest campaigns did not stop on the city and all over its neighborhoods, such as the neighborhood of Tariq Halab, Mashal Arba'in, Al-Taqiyya, and Al-Hamidiyya, in addition to the blocking of roads and besieging the city, as well as burning and ruining shops. But despite all the violations committed against the citizens by the regime forces, in Hama, the rebels insist on uniting against al-Assad and condemning his crimes, as well as calling for the Syrian Freedom Army to help Syria and help the citizens to achieve their goals and live a better life.
The regime's military campaigns increased the bombing in Deir ez-Zor, which was accompanied by helicopter artillery shelling. Also, intense gunfire has been heard near the Officers' Club in the direction of Al-Madlaji roundabout, while the random bombing continued in the residential districts of the city, such as Al-Jabliya, Al-Hamidiyya, Al-Qusur, Sheikh Yassin, and more. Meanwhile, these cities and outskirts of Deir ez-Zor have witnessed a fierce military campaign that killed dozens and injured many others. Dozens killed and injured victims were reported today in what the General Authority for the Syrian Revolution has named the Monday of the Furat Blood. Deir ez-Zor is being bombed. This was due to the violent artillery and tank bombing, which lasted for 4 consecutive days and targeted a wide range of neighborhoods. Meanwhile, a funeral was held today honoring the murdered victims from yesterday's attacks.
25/6/2012 استشهد في دير الزور.
The suburbs of Deir ez-Zor are still under constant shelling by the regime forces that is using artillery tanks and mortar shells, which caused massive damage. The neighborhood of Al-Hamidiyya, Sheikh Yassin, Qusur, and Al-Jura were heavily bombarded by the regime, causing the death of dozens of victims and left many others injured. In the suburbs of Deir ez-Zor, the regime bombed many towns, where the random bombardment reached numerous towns and villages, killing many civilians and wounding others critically. Turkish television reported that Syrian officers ranked major general, colonels, and a lieutenant, in addition to 33 soldiers, all defected from the Syrian regime forces and are now on Turkish territories. Several victims were killed and others wounded in a bombing by the regime army in the city of Ma'arat al-Nu'man in Idlib, where as many were critically wounded in an explosion that shook the town of Urim al-Joz. Also, activists reported that Sahl al-Rouj experienced a campaign of raids and arrests, while the village of Marzita held a funeral for the two killed victims, Muhammad and Mustafa Qutaish. Moreover, a mourning protest went out in solidarity with other affected cities demanding the downfall of the Syrian regime.
The Syrian army and security forces are still carrying heavy military campaigns in the cities and towns of Idlib province. The shelling and the bombing led to heavy destruction and devastation that resulted in massacres, which claimed the lives of several civilians. Meanwhile, the regime deployed its army members and security forces from barriers in Kfar Nubbul and Kfar Uayyid to settle in the towns of Al-Has, and the regime continues its raids and arrests in the areas of Sahl al-Rouj, while bombing with artillery and warplanes on the villages of Ma'arat al-Nu'man and Al-Zawiya mountain. The regime's army continuous military operations drives people to continue in their everyday demonstrations, stressing on their commitment to overthrow al-Assad's regime.
Coming up later in the bulletin, the citizens of Homs suffer a humanitarian crisis. Welcome back. You are watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. In the coastal city of Latakia, the neighborhood of Slaiba has undergone raids and arrest campaigns, where many activists were captured, while the regime forces continued bombing many other parts of Latakia, killing and wounding many citizens. This happened at a time when the regime tanks attacked the village of Mezian, while helicopters simultaneously hovered over it. The city of Latakia is still being besieged by the regime forces that, according to them, are targeting terrorist groups. This bombing has caused the death of many civilians in the city. More about Latakia we will see next.
The regime forces constantly bombarded Latakia suburbs today, saying that they are after targeting alleged terrorist groups that are corrupting the country. The military operations targeted the areas of Mount Kurds, Al-Hafeh, and all the neighboring towns and villages. Mortar shells were used to target residential buildings in the villages of Al-Mrej, Marj al-Zawiya, Marj Khawkha, Durwin, and Akko. This shelling left the areas in massive ruins. This comes at the time where the citizens of these areas held funerals and bid farewell to their loved ones who were killed during the current and the previous bombardment on the towns. In this area, members of a family, including a child, were injured by a mortar shell after the regime started its military campaigns, whereas other citizens were left traumatized by the massive amount of shells that fell constantly onto the cities. But despite all the bombardment, chaos and death that consumed the place, and despite all the regime's various violations against the citizens, the rebels are resilient in their march towards freedom, chanting for dignity and the downfall of al-Assad's regime.
The Syrian regime shelled more than 6 cities and towns in Aleppo with heavy artillery and rocket launchers, together with intense gunfire from heavy machine guns. And according to activists, several neighborhoods witnessed raids and arrests. It also has been reported that the regime's security forces shot at the mourners in a funeral procession in the neighborhood of Saif ad-Dawla. And in another development, activists broadcasted a video that showed the bodies of doctors detained and burnt by the regime for simply treating the wounded victims of the regime's attacks. We apologize for not broadcasting these images for their gruesome nature. Activists in Aleppo reported that fierce clashes were occurring between Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces in the city of Aleppo. They added that the massive explosions were heard in the neighboring towns. Meanwhile, the lawyers of Aleppo held strikes in the Justice Palace, where they condemned the regime and their crimes committed by them against the citizens of Syria. This comes after the lawyers held many strikes against al-Assad previously, but used to be captured as prisoners by the regime forces. The 3 students, in the University of Aleppo were captured by the regime's air intelligence forces as they were trying to medically aid the injured. The students, Hazem Batikh, Basel Aslan, and Mus'ab Barad, were captured, burnt, and mutilated, then thrown onto the streets. As a retaliation, the citizens in Aleppo took to the streets in massive protests, where they demanded the punishment of al-Assad and his regime for all their crimes.
Activists in Aleppo and its countryside continue to take images of the heavy bombardment suffered by the villages and towns under the regime's armor, in a scene where the spirit of revolt overcome the injustice of the regime and its brutality. The bombardment started in Qaptan, where mortar shells fell heavily, targeting civilian houses, leaving destruction behind. That reveals the intensity of the shelling and the persistence of al-Assad forces to use all types of weapons.
هذه هي الصواريخ التي يقصفنا بها النظام الأسدي المتوحش.
In Kafar Halab, the citizens collect the weapons and the missiles that were targeting them. And in the city of Al-Bab, the images document daily the flights of helicopters which bombards the city, in addition to other images that show snipers stationed on the roofs of high buildings, shooting at civilians, according to activists. Meanwhile, the continuous shelling on Azaz and Sam'an mountain resulted in several injuries. And on the other side, the revolution is witnessing every day an increase in defections from al-Assad's army. And Taha Muhammad was among several soldiers who have declared that they joined the Freedom Syrian Army in the past 2 days, announcing his rejection of the repressive practices and crimes committed against civilians.
The cities of Dar'a al-Balad and Al-Karak witnessed violent bombing from the borders of Dar'a, which caused many injuries at a time where there is a lack in medical staff and equipment. And in Khirbat Ghazale, the sounds of heavy fire were heard, while the cities of Nawa and Sheikh Miskin witnessed campaigns of raids and arrests that caused the destruction of several houses. The town of Maraba in Dar'a witnessed today heavy shelling from helicopters, while activists reported that 10 rockets were fired on the town. And in Busra Sham, huge explosions were heard in the city, while activists said that the shelling comes from the nearby regime barriers, which has been targeting the western and eastern regions of the cities. Meanwhile, at least 2 victims fell dead in the town of Kafr Shams, which was subjected to heavy shelling and clashes between the Freedom Syrian Army and the regime army. Coming up later in the bulletin, the citizens of Homs are suffering a humanitarian crisis. Shelling was renewed on the city of Al-Hula in Homs, where the regime army attacked it with heavy artillery and tanks, firing at houses using automatic weapons. Similar attacks took place in Telbise, where air missiles shelled most of its neighborhoods, while many houses in Rastan were bombed and destroyed. Elsewhere, the shelling continued on the old districts of Homs, causing a lot of damage. Activists in Homs reported that the shells fell at an average of 3 shells per minute. Elsewhere, the bombing from helicopters targeted the town of Makramiya in the northern suburb. Meanwhile, images coming from Homs showed the devastation within the city of Homs due to the heavy shelling that targeted all residential buildings without exceptions. The neighborhood of Al-Khalidiyya in Homs is still being subjected to intense shelling and gunfire from heavy weapons. Activists said that the attacks came from the troops that are stationed around the neighborhood as they are trying to break into it, while the military forces stormed the neighborhood of Karam al-Shami today amid heavy gunfire.
حمص المحتل حي القصور 24/6/2012.
The head of the military council in the Syrian Free Army, Brigadier General Mustafa Sheikh, sent a letter to international relief and political organizations warning that the province of Homs is under the heaviest attacks by the regime's forces, which gathered in large numbers at the entrances of the province.
The citizens in Homs are still pleading for someone to aid them, as the city still suffers from a catastrophic lack of medical and food supplies, which is causing many deaths for the citizens who are injured but can't be treated in the right amount of time.
لا في عنا مازوت لا عنا كهرباء لا في عنا شيء خالص شو بدي احكي لا احكي.
The citizens in the besieged city of Homs are trapped inside the city and are under the threat of being killed due to the constant bombardment. This comes after many calls for help had been made, but international organizations were not able to enter the city due to the besiegement that the regime is applying and surrounding the city with. In this manner, General Robert Mood said that the mission of the observers is still suspended. This comes after his meeting with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Syria. Mood confirmed that he told the government of Syria about the UN and the international humanitarian organizations' fears of the increasing military campaigns in the country, adding that his team is considering to resume their mission soon. And with a deteriorating humanitarian situation in Homs and the need of more than 1.5 million citizens for help, the International Red Crescent organization fails yet again to enter the troubled city.
We have now made a second démarche, in fact, today, to go back, so that we can go back to enter into the relevant places in Homs, together with the Syrian Red Crescent.
We will find out more about the situation in Homs from Abu Rami, the spokesman of the Syrian Revolution General Commission in Homs, who is now with us on the line. Abu Rami, good evening and thank you for being with us. Abu Rami, can you hear me?
Good evening, thank you for you.
Abu Rami, can you please give us an idea of what's going on in Homs? I mean, the humanitarian situation is really deteriorating. What is the situation like now?
Well, humanitarian conditions deteriorate by the day with a lack of electricity, water, medicine, gas, diesel, baby milk, and basic needs to remain alive. Many injuries remain trapped at risk of death due to untreated wounds and injuries. We have under siege for that.
It seems that we lost contact with Abu Rami from Homs. We will try to get in touch with you again, Abu Rami. Moving on with the news bulletin. In Damascus, explosions and heavy gunfires were heard in the eastern Daraya and Basatin al-Qadam, according to activists. Furthermore, the citizens of Al-Maidan neighborhood blocked the Corniche road, which was followed by a massive demonstration that demanded the downfall of al-Assad. In Damascus suburbs, the regime forces invaded the city of Daraya. This comes at a time where 2 mortar shells fell on the city of Zabadani, whereas the city of Zamalka witnessed gunfire coming from snipers that were positioned on the rooftops of buildings. In Jisrin, the regime forces bombed the town using mortar shells, injuring many civilians. Meanwhile, in Saqba, images broadcasted by activists showed the military forces invading the city. And other sources said that the number of victims that died in Damascus and its suburbs reached at least 7 today, including women and children. Staying in the capital and the capital suburbs, explosions shook the eastern Ghouta this morning in the cities of Zamalka and Hamuriya, while Douma was bombed with mortar shelling that targeted the Al-Mal'ab neighborhood. This happened at a time when the regime snipers were deployed in the Halima hospital, while more shelling took place in Arbin and Harasta. The bombing followed a night protest that demanded the overthrow of the Assad regime. It seems we are able to speak to Abu Rami, the spokesperson from the Syrian Revolution General Commission in Homs, to tell us more about the deteriorating situation in Homs, especially from a humanitarian point of view. Abu Rami, thank you for being with us again. Can you hear me?
Thank you for you, and I'm sorry, we are found very difficult situation to be in touch with media like yours for the free media.
This is absolutely understood. You were talking to me about the injured people and how the medical help is very difficult to reach them.
Yes, okay.
Please go on.
Yes, exactly. We are in the presence of the siege that forced on us. Nowadays, we can't go outside or enter any kind of medical supports for us, any medical tools, any medical equipments also. So we can't reach to these injured people. And if we can to reach of any one of these wanted, we don't have the necessary necessary elements to make the necessary surgery for. So, unfortunately, most of them die between our hands because of the lack and shortage of medical tools and supplies. And if we will talk about the neighborhoods that under shelling and under destructions nowadays, we will talk about certainly about George Shayah. The regime led a violent military attack on the neighborhood today, starting early morning with missiles and artillery bombing the remaining buildings. Exceeded 25 missiles just today. 25 missiles just today. Black smoke has filled the streets and skies in the area with spy planes spotted above.
Abu Rami, thank you very much for your input, and we will try to get in touch with you later to get more updates about the situation in Aleppo. Thank you very much. In Homs, rather. Thank you. And before we end our bulletin, here's a reminder of today's main headlines. Constant bombing on all Syrian cities. 61 victims died today, mostly in Hama, Idlib and Deir Zur. Activists speak about the destruction of the entire neighborhoods in Homs, while the Syrian regime army warns of a genocide.
أقوى وأعنف قصف تمهيدي بالصواريخ والمدفعية والدبابات ويحضر هذا النظام.
And huge crowds condemned the crimes in Aleppo, and citizens in Damascus cut off the Corniche Road in the Maidan neighborhood. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. You can join us again tomorrow at the same time for the latest updates on the Syrian revolution. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.